So in this video, I'm just going to review and break down the shader that I created that makes procedural outlines based on a grayscale mask that you import into UEFN. So everything looks really good. Everything looks perfectly smooth as the mask. The only downside that I see on using this method is on outside hard corners. If you zoom in pretty far, you could start to see some stair stepping on the hard edges and the hard corner edges. And if this really bothered you, we're using 16 offsets in this material right now. If you bumped it up to 32, they would be twice as smooth. But I think in most cases, 16 is probably going to work for most people. And there's no one solution that works best for any case. So there's other methods for creating outlines, and you should look at, the method that works best for you. So I'm just going to show you first the final instance after the material is created, and you create a material instance. It's pretty flexible. It lets you change the line offset. You can make it thinner really easily. You could bump it up, and it's really easy just to slide, the slider to change the line thickness. Again, if you start making it really, really big, the hard corner edges, their stair stepping will become a little more pronounced, so you have to be careful about that. I think some, thicknesses in the range of around 2 look pretty good, and you don't really notice them that much. Especially if the object is going to be a little bit further away from the player, you probably won't notice them at all. You could easily change the base texture, for any version that you're doing, and then you could easily change the inside and outside colors of the mask, or the inside and the outline of the material. So just by changing these two parameters. So next, I'm just going to review the finished node setup of the material. And if people kind of have a good understanding of what they're doing, this will kind of help you get started. And in the comments or in another reply somewhere, I'll list all the coordinates that I use to offset, if that will help you. But basically, as far as the color, we have a texture object which goes into a reroute node, which I'll be using later. It goes into a texture, and I'm taking, because it's a grayscale texture, I'm just taking the R and bringing that right into a alpha of a lerp node, and I'm inputting 2 color values for the inside and the line color. That goes right into the base color of the material. The material itself is set to translucent, because we'll be using opacity in this. And then we will be having the texture coordinates. I have that into a reroute node also, because we'll be using it all over to keep things a little bit cleaner. And a line offset, which is just a vector 1 going into another reroute. And then the rest of it is pretty simple. It's just copies of the same kind of setup. So we have a vector 2. This one is showing the first offset. So the first offset is 1 for X and 0 for the Y. And then that's multiplied by the offset, which is just this vector 1 value that we used earlier. That's multiplied by 0.01, just because I like working better with numbers that are closer to integers. If I didn't do that, we'd be typing in, values of like 0.025 for our line width. So this just keeps that a little bit simpler. Then we add that to the texture coordinates. This is another reroute node. That goes into the texture. So it goes into the UV and into the texture. The texture mask, the texture parameter goes into the reroute node up here, and that just goes right into the texture input on the this texture node right here. And then basically we're adding all of these to the subsequent nodes that are below it. And all those get added together, go into a saturate node, and that goes into the opacity mask. If we disconnect the opacity over here, you can see basically we have the base texture for the inside fill, and it fills the whole outside. And all these other nodes are basically setting up the mask for the opacity. So all these other sections down here are the exact same setup. They just keep on getting added together. And each of these vector 2s will use some of the other coordinates. And basically these coordinates are 16 evenly spaced points on a circle, which you could figure out with trigonometry, or just plug in these numbers if you want. So if you look at the whole node, you can see everything. I have 16 setups of these, and they all get added together in groups, and then they get added down the line. They go into the saturate and go right into the opacity. So that's basically the texture. It's pretty simple. It's just a lot of things that are duplicated and added together. Um, again, check the comments or another post, and I'll list the coordinates if you want to kind of try to build this, yourself and see how it works for you, or if you want to come up with any other modifications that might work better. Yeah, I'd love to see if anyone has any suggestions. So for the people that want a better understanding of how and why I did everything, I'm going to start building this out and maybe kind of talk more about it. For the people that understand all this, you could probably stop now. It's probably not necessary. But it sounded like people were kind of curious about why I did this and, kind of my thought process behind it. So maybe it will help you a little bit. So just to give you an idea of what the node setup is doing, we're using the original texture to set up the colors, basically. So we're going to use the lerp node to set the white to be the color of the inside of the texture, and then the black will be the outside color of the texture. And then all the other nodes are basically setting up the opacity mask that we're going to be using to create the outline. So we have like the original texture, and every time we offset the coordinates a little bit, it's like we're making a copy of this texture, and we're just offsetting it a little bit in each direction. And as you can see, like the more we do this and make more copies, it kind of gets thicker and thicker. So that will kind of create our opacity mask, and you can kind of see that's also why like the hard corners will get a little jagged in the process. As far as the coordinates that we're using, we are going to be setting it up to use, if you just use like 4, they would be using these coordinates right here, which you're seeing. We would use like a 1, 0, a 0, -1, -1, 0, and a 0, 1 on these. But that would only give us 4 offsets, so we want more than that. So we're going to essentially be using 16 offsets that are evenly spaced around the circle. Again, you could use trigonometry to figure them out, but the coordinates that I used are these, and it's essentially just 3 numbers. You just have to make sure you're using the positive and negatives correctly. So you're either having a 1 or a 0, 0.92, 0.38, and 0.71. So you could probably do a screen grab of these or look into the comments if you wanted to see the coordinates that I'm using for the offsets. And those coordinates are the coordinates for each of these circles that I have on this circle. And with the coordinate system in UEFN, the positive is like to the upper left and the negative is to the lower right, which seems a little odd to me because like I think like in math it would kind of be different than that. But that's kind of what it is. It doesn't really matter as long as you use these coordinates. But that's kind of like the basic understanding of how we're offsetting and kind of why we're offsetting. But if we go back to the kind of the basic node, you can see we have, I'm going to disconnect the opacity mask. So we kind of see we have our texture going into a lerp node, and that goes into the alpha. I'm just using the R channel because this is a grayscale mask, and the R is just going to be the grayscale information of that. You don't need to use the RGB channel going in there. You could just use the R channel. And then I have 2 colors, 2 vector 3s, which are set as colors, and I have them changed to parameters so we could edit them later in our material instance. And the first one goes into B, which will be the white, and the second one goes into A, which will be the black, which essentially will be the background, or which will become the outline once we add the opacity mask. One other thing, I almost always will use grayscale textures as my base input for any type of graphic, rather than using a full RGB image with the color set. And my preference is to do it that way for a few reasons. First, you end up with a single channel of grayscale information as compared to like an RGB file with a mask. So you end up with 4 channels RGB in your alpha. So it's a lot smaller file size, good way to kind of optimize your projects. But it also gives me the flexibility, like in this case, if we used an RGB image for our mask, changing the colors would be much more difficult because we're starting with just the base mask and using some a basic node setup. It gives us the ability to now change the colors of the inside and the outline easily as compared to if we were just using an RGB image. So obviously lots of times it's necessary to use a full color image if you have some textural elements or very photographic elements that need to kind of overlay or use as your base. But for most solid colors, I think lots of times people will benefit of just if they just use a grayscale texture as their input for those types of graphics. And then as we set up the opacity mask, to kind of help you understand it a little better, sometimes it helps to, I'm just going to disconnect the base color and I'm going to put the opacity mask into the base color. You can kind of see what we're doing. The only other thing which I would probably recommend is when you import your grayscale texture, there's the two things that are probably good to do. First, under the compression settings, you want to set it to mask no sRGB. You don't want any gamma correction applied to this grayscale information. It's not like a grayscale photograph you're looking at. This is just raw data that you want to use. So you don't want any gamma correction applied to these. So these grayscale masks like that you're using as masks and nodes and more for data, they should be set to mask no sRGB. And it probably doesn't matter too much, but if you have any of these white areas that are close to the edge, it's probably better under the advanced section to have the X and Y axis tiling set to clamp. And what that will do is that will just extend any black. As this texture moves left and right, it won't wrap the texture around. We want just that to stay black no matter what. So those are really the only two settings I changed on the actual texture, when I import it. So the first thing you could see is I'm not using any rewrap nodes here, so this one will start getting a little bit messier. But again, the first thing we have is we have our first offset, and I'm just using the 1 for the X and 0 for the Y. Again, we're going to multiply that by our offset, which I'm just using as 1 as a default now. We want just 1 as to be like our base. This is how big the line will be. And then again, I'm multiplying this by 0.01 because if I didn't do that, I would have to use really, really small values in our line offset. And for me, when I think, it's just easier for me to use a value of like 1, 2, or 3, or 2.5 rather than 0.025. It's just a lot more easy. It's a little bit more flexible for me to do that. So we are taking the texture coordinates, and then we're going to add what we just did here to the texture coordinates. So basically, we're adding the texture coordinates, and in this case, we're shifting the texture over to the left, essentially, a little bit. And if I change this, this vector 2, if I change the x value, if we look at the texture, if I change this to 0, well, it's going to be hard to see, but the texture is kind of centered now. Let me change this to like 10. You can see how, if I change this to 10, it shifts it way over to the left. So essentially what we're doing with the offsets, we're moving this texture around like 16 times in a circle, and we're going to kind of blend them all together. So that's the first one. So to basically do the next one, what we would do is we would take these group of nodes right here. I'm just going to copy and paste them and bring them down. So again, we want the texture coordinate to go into this add, and we want this line offset to go into this multiply here, and then we want this texture object to go into the texture input here. So this is the next one. If we go back to our how I have the coordinates, so this one is 0.92, 0.38. So we could go back here and we get 0.92, 0.38. And then we have these, so we have to kind of add these together somehow. So basically, again, we could go off the red node, and I'm just going to go to an add node. You just type add after dragging off that. I'm going to switch that back to the bottom one and take this one to the top one, just so it's a little more clean as far as the node setup. And then we could take that and go into the saturate. Okay, so now this is the first one. It's going to be hard to see here. If we zoom in, maybe in the corner a little bit, we might be able to see. Well, even that is a little bit hard to see because there's only two of them and they're pretty small. But basically, now we have the first two of our offsets, and then we're going to continue that all the way down until we have all 16, and then essentially the next two we would take. You could take these if you want, copy and paste those. Drag the texture coordinates into here. Drag the texture object into this and grab the line offset into here. So again, we're going to do that all along, and that's why I use the reroute nodes. And basically, the reroute nodes just let you. It's kind of like a tunnel for the nodes. So like in this case, I'm just going to drag this out, and if you go under utility, add a named reroute declaration node, and I'm just going to call this like texture path. And then you could go right through this also. But now instead of dragging this same node all the way down for each one of these, I could just right click and go to my named reroutes and click the texture path and drag it right into there. And it'll keep things a little bit cleaner. They don't have to have 16 of these paths stretched all over. So now I'm just copying and pasting this one into the texture input. So that cleans up these. And again, I did the same thing with the texture coordinates, which need to be used 16 times, and the line offset, which need to be used 16 times. So again, I duplicated the next two. I added them together, and then essentially I need to add these two together. So I could go drag off this, just type of add those together. And drag that into the saturate. So, and the reason why I'm using a saturate node, basically, this this grayscale texture has a value of 0 where it's black and 1 where it's white. When we add these together, obviously, 0 plus 0 it's still 0, but 1 plus 1 becomes 2. So the value of the white, essentially, even though it looks white, it's kind of like a super white, so it's a value of 2. And then after we've added all 4 of them together, at this point the white is a value of 4. And a lot of times it doesn't matter, but I prefer to play it safe. And basically, when you run through the saturate node, it clamps everything between 0 and 1. Like, I don't want any super whites or super blacks or negative numbers or really high numbers. I want this mask to be simply between 0 and 1. So I run it through saturate after everything is added together. And then when I bring that into the opacity, I just know I'm not going to get any weird things, especially when you're using colors that go way above 1, they'll start looking super bright sometimes and they might cause some odd effects that you're not expecting. So again, that's where we have these 4 nodes essentially set up. Well, we don't have these connected yet, but and then we would just plug in the next 2 numbers, and then we would continue all the way down the line. So if we go back to the finish node, that is essentially what we have here, where we have all 16 offsets using those numbers that I showed before. Everything is added together. Basically, they're added together in groups of 2. These 2 are added together, these 2, these 2, these 2, all the way up. And then those groups are added together as well. So everything's added together. And then everything runs through the saturate node into the opacity input. And that's pretty much the whole final material. So after that is created, you could go to your content drawer and just create a material instance of this final material. And then when you have the instance, you will be able to adjust all of the parameters that you have set to be parameters already. So again, the ones that I wanted to adjust were the inside and outside colors, or the inside and line colors. So this one, if you have like a vector 3 and you want this to be a parameter that you could edit in your material instance after you create your color or your vector 3, you'd right click it and convert to parameter. and that will let it be available when you create the material instance. So I did that with the two colors. I did that with the texture. I did that with the texture object. I turned that into a parameter. Um, and I did that with the line offset as well, because I want to be able to edit those four things. So that is pretty much it. Again, the final thing, you end up with the four parameters you can edit. I'd love to see what other people are doing with it, or if they have other suggestions, or if people come up with other ideas. The thing I like about this most is you basically need the one grayscale texture to start with, and everything else is pretty much done procedurally, and overall it looks pretty good, I'd say. So let me know if you have any questions, or if you have any other suggestions, maybe how to improve it. I'd love to hear. Thanks.